Hello and welcome to Juliet and Lucy's Quiet Leadership Revolution, the podcast for senior and aspiring leaders who want to make their voice heard and their impact felt through thoughtful, confident, reflective leadership. I'm Juliet Corbett, an executive coach and strategist, and I work one-to-one with senior leaders, guiding them to find their strategic focus, empower their teams, and regain control over their time.
And I'm Lucy Gower. I'm a facilitator, trainer and coach, and I empower leaders to build their happy, confident and high-performing teams. Today we're going to talk about the challenge of speaking up and making your voice heard. And I think the context that I'm approaching this from is, have you ever been in a meeting and there's been lots of senior people there, more senior than you, and for some reason you might be feeling like you need to say something and you need to make sure that your voice is heard and that you are contributing something worthwhile, yet something is getting in your way and something is stopping you.
Yeah. Actually, interesting. This obviously has relevance to newer leaders who are getting used to this skill of speaking up when there are more senior people around the table. Actually, I'm not sure it goes away. I think I've certainly met some really experienced leaders who, in their own context, find this very comfortable. But actually, when they're in maybe a different board or a trustee situation where they're volunteering, or an organisation where they're in a meeting with peers, other organisations, maybe in a professional body setting, it can be just as hard sometimes. It's really interesting that this isn't necessarily something that's a once and done skill we learn. There's something contextual about it as well.
Yeah, absolutely agree. And I think for me, it's thinking about like what's going on for you personally that's making it hard to speak up. Maybe that it is because you are a fairly new leader and there's people with much more experience in the room, or maybe that it is about the different context, but understanding what's happening for you that's somehow helping you get in your own way of saying what you need to say, I think is a helpful starting point.
Definitely. And actually also one of the points that you made in preparation for this conversation is critically important to plant in your mind now as a listener, as you're listening to this. This is also, if you're a senior leader, how do you ensure that you create a culture, an environment in which others can speak up? Is the other way of looking at the same topic from a different position, maybe around that table, that meeting table.
Yes. Yeah, because there's equal emphasis, isn't there? There's the person that can't get a word in or feels that they haven't got the power to say something. There's the person that is in charge of chairing the meeting, ensuring that all voices are heard, and it's a two-way street.
Yes, definitely. So where do we start? What kind of approach do you think we should take to this conversation, Lucy?
I think there's something around thinking about like what's happening here that's making it difficult for me to speak up. What's going on? Is it an inner critic that is jeopardizing? Is it that the dynamic of the room is feeling uncomfortable for some reason? But I think it starts with you as an individual by being able to identify what's getting in your way. Then when you know, or you have a hunch about what it might be that's getting in your way, you can do something to overcome that. But you have to kind of unpick it a little bit first. That would be my starting point. What is it about this dynamic in this room that is making me feel like I can't get my voice heard?
Yeah. So actually, just for a personal story, I think for me, one of the things that it took me a long time to figure out was the physiological side of this as well, which isn't necessarily possible to manage, but once you know what's happening, you can then understand what's happened. So quite often, and actually, to be really honest, it happens for me now when I'm sitting in large conference halls, 500 people. I know I want to ask a question because I've got a really good question I want to ask at this panel at the end. And I know that I'm about to put my hand up in front of all of these people, get the microphone, and potentially, if I'm picked, ask that question. And what's really interesting for me is that my heart starts to race. So there's a physiological response, and it starts to race as soon as I think of a good question. So as soon as I think of the question, that's it. That's the trigger for this physiological response. So I think understanding what's going on for you, there could be mindset elements to this as well. And And you've referred to kind of the inner critic, who am I to speak up? There's the feeling of trust of how that's going to be received, of the psychological safety of the context, the people around you. And there's also a physiological element to it as well of you're not necessarily, so I still can't control my heart rate when that happens. But what I
Mhm.
am able to do now is go, oh, that's okay. That's my body trying to keep me
Yeah.
safe. It's trying to keep me in the
Mhm.
crowd and make sure I don't stand up and put myself in danger, in inverted commas.
Yeah.
But knowing that means I'm still very capable to raise my hand and ask the question. And although I still have to control my voice very carefully, actually, as I ask it, um, but even that self knowledge is sufficient for me to overcome the physiological side. Um,
Absolutely.
yeah,
And there was something that you said earlier about you can't control the physiological side.
you
You
can.
might be
Yeah,
able to with a bit of
yeah,
uh, deliberate practice, even things like noticing your breath,
yeah,
doing a breath in for four, holding for four, breath out for four, reduces the cortisol and adrenaline, which is flooding around your body, keeping you safe from stepping up. So
yeah,
if you get that kind of heart racing, oh, I don't think I can do it. I think there's some of the things that you can look at about controlling your adrenaline and cortisol, which I've got a lot of content on in terms of like confidence, because
yeah.
obviously it's very closely linked, but
Mm,
breathing exercises, what you allow your inner critic to tell you. So, Juliet, I completely agree. Oh, thanks ever so much for keeping me safe and keeping me in the crowd. I appreciate that. I'm going
yeah,
to raise my hand now, and even just that conversation in your head can help to um, reduce some of those feelings of
yeah,
not wanting to step up. For me, I get worried that I won't remember the question that I wanted to ask. So I always make sure that I jot it down. So that's a worry that's gone out of my mind.
yeah. Me too. Me too. The other one that I find useful, so the breathing definitely find helpful. The other one that I've always found helpful is planting both my feet firmly on the floor,
Mm,
like really firmly, as if I'm about to step up, but I'm not, I'm still seated, like firmly
yeah,
connecting myself. And then there's some kind of strange feeling of being connected to the earth. Like even if I'm on a fifth floor
yeah,
conference room, it doesn't really matter. I'm
yeah,
connected to literally to the earth.
yeah.
And so there's something quite grounding literally around doing that too. So you mentioned some of the other things that can hold you back. So I wonder whether there are mindsets that we can talk
Yeah.
about that might be helpful for people to understand. And maybe as you're listening, sort of question, is that something that I feel that applies to me? And you're likely to feel that some of these don't apply, but there might be one or two that we can mention that
Mm,
might land with someone. So what sorts of inner critic, what could that inner critic say to you, which is going to affect your ability to stand
yeah.
up at that or to say what you want to say at that moment?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, your inner critic typically will say, well, you're not good enough. Who are you to stand up? You don't know your stuff. You'll get found out.
Mm,
The typical inner critic is all about you're not good enough and you're going to get found out.
mhm,
And I think there's something about taking it away from you and it's thinking about why is it important to speak up? It might be because you're speaking up for yourself, but it might be about your team, it might be about your organization. What's the bigger picture about why you are in that meeting, in that conference, wherever it is today, and why is it important that you speak up for the impact on your team and your organization and try and it's not about you, you're a
mm,
messenger. That
mm,
can be a helpful way of looking at it and removes that. If you've ever got any of that, oh, everyone's looking at me, or what if I mess up my words, what if I say it wrong? It doesn't leave room for that because you're focused on this is this is an important point that I need to make for the
mm.
greater good, whatever that might look like.
Yeah,
That would be my
absolutely.
first thought.
Yeah. And when you mentioned there, what if I get found out? Ask a question. Instead, you don't need to make a statement or suggest a solution. You can frame a question,
Yes.
which can be an entirely leading question, which can suggest what you
Yes.
think as well. But you can frame a question to the room, which potentially removes that fear of being found out. Actually, you're just pointing out something that hasn't yet been considered. by pointing
Yeah.
to it with a question.
And
Um,
again, that starting point of help me understand
yeah,
um,
yeah,
can be a helpful confidence framer.
yeah,
And I can pretty much guarantee that if there is something that you have a question mark about, either that you don't understand or you want more clarity on, other people in the room will be massively grateful that you stepped up and asked, because other people will be thinking the same thing too.
yes, yes. The other questions that can be really helpful are connecting it to the strategic intent or the strategic goals.
Mm-hmm.
So something like we're getting into a lot of detail about this idea or this solution or this project that we've got. Um, can we just take a step back and just confirm we all understand how this connects through to our strategic
Yeah,
objectives?
yeah,
That's a great question because you don't have the answer to that question. You might think you know the answer to that question, which is great. You can also say, because I'm seeing this connection to our strategic
yeah,
objectives, which is wonderful. Um,
yeah,
but actually, especially in a meeting where there's a lot of detail going on and you want to take it back up to the higher
yeah.
purpose, and if you think there is no connection to that strategic intent or that strategic goal, and that we're being distracted by a nice shiny object that isn't essential, that
Mm-hmm.
can be a way to point it out without necessarily blaming anybody who's chairing the meeting for allowing it to go slightly off track.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, I agree. I think there's something as well. You mentioned, I guess, body language in terms of your
Mm,
feet on the floor. There's things that you can do around your body language to help give you more presence if you're in that spot. I guess I'm thinking of smaller meetings where you're there with your thing that you want to say, but people keep chipping in and you're being polite or
mm,
you're more introverted. So for me, I sit on the introverted end of the spectrum. So this is me kind of half putting a hand up and going, and then undermining myself from not
yeah.
um, saying it really confidently. Your body language plays a massive part in how you confident you feel, but how also other people are perceiving you. So that kind of sitting sitting tall, open body language, where you might sit fairly still and you're not trying to sort of poke your hand up in the air. You're perhaps holding a steady hand up for when the chair comes round to you.
Yeah.
Um, and I still feel like I don't talk over other people. That's the right thing for me. And sometimes I know that when I've been in organisations where I've felt a little bit uncertain about how much I can speak, I'll say to the chair, I've got some things to say about this. Can you make sure that like you look me in the eye when I've got a
Yes.
moment that I can do it? So you can brief the people that are in your meeting with you to support you and be your allies.
I think that's a really good point, actually. So the role of the chair, catching the eye of the chair and using that steady raised hand to
Yeah.
catch, as opposed to the constantly attempting to interrupt and not being able to, which doesn't necessarily
Yeah.
portray an enormous amount of authority and gravitas. Um,
Quite.
but the catching the eye of the chair and just signaling, I have a point I want to make. Ideally, the chair then remembers, a good chair might write the name down so they remember to come back to you. But even if they forget, you then have the ability to then actually interrupt if you need to, because maybe the chair's just misremembered that you had a point to make, but you have caught the eye of the chair. And so you have the ability to then step in with slightly more authority at that moment. Um, and yes, I think your point about pre-conversations is really important as well. We did an episode some time ago about preparing for difficult conversations, which actually, Lucy, was one of our most popular episodes. So if you haven't listened to
Uh,
that yet, we'll put the link in the episode notes.
yes.
There we were talking about preparing more for a one-to-one
Mm-hmm.
challenging conversation or difficult conversation, which you had anticipated that you needed to have. But actually going into a meeting, if you know you want to make a point, which maybe is contrary to the views of others around the
Mm-hmm.
table, sometimes preparing for that meeting by having a quiet word with the chair or with one or two other members of the meeting who you know will be supportive of your point of view just enables you to make sure you're teed up to make that point at the most impactful
Yeah.
moment.
Yeah.
And also it's not always great to surprise the chair with something completely left wing without having
Mm-hmm.
pre-briefed them in advance. So sometimes that's also a courtesy to make sure the chair's aware that actually I really want to make a point which is somewhat different in this meeting. This is the main gist of my argument. You're not
Yeah.
asking permission necessarily, depending on the context, but you're saying, just wanted to make you aware, I really want to make sure this point comes into this particular discussion.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think there's something there as well, if we're thinking back to kind of confidence. and speaking up. So I suppose earlier when we were talking about that kind of fear of putting our hand up and saying something in a meeting. There's a new layer when you know that you're not saying, yes, I agree, excellent. You're
Mm,
saying, I've got a different perspective here and a different point of view. I think all the things that we talked about in terms of body language and taking breaths and reducing the adrenaline and cortisol apply here, but you probably have to be even more deliberate about it because there's a higher stake to putting your hand up and saying something that is controversial or different than there is to agreeing or supporting somebody else. There's something in there around what I call a knowing doing gap. So we talk a lot about psychological safety and teams that disagree being a good thing. If you have groupthink, there's a challenge there because you're all agreeing with each other and staying in a safe place rather than having an objective conversation with different perspectives and viewpoints. And I think some of our one's ability to be able to stand up is created by the environment of that meeting. How safe do you feel to do it? And I know that I've spoken up in meetings where I felt safe to say something that's different and controversial, and it's been an extremely different experience to the meeting where I haven't felt safe to do it. So I think there's something around your own confidence, and if you're chairing a meeting, to create that environment where it
yeah,
genuinely is okay for people to have a different point of view. Ask,
yeah,
does anyone have a different point of view here? I'm interested in hearing some different perspectives about this.
yeah.
Be deliberate about it.
And even if there's silence of that, saying who wants to play devil's advocate, like who wants to actually put the opposing argument to us. So it makes it really clear actually you can detach yourself from that argument as you
Yeah.
make it. But I want to hear
Yeah.
the downsides, the opposing point of view.
Yeah, I want to check that we are not in a situation of groupthink or a situation where
Yeah.
we've got blind spots that we're missing.
What are we not seeing? Yeah.
Yeah,
What are we not seeing? What are we not hearing? What are we not saying?
yeah.
Really
Who
important.
have we, what voices are not in this room, actually?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And I think as a backup plan, if you're chairing a meeting where there is a properly high stakes decision,
Mm,
sometimes it's even worth a little short one-to-one conversation just to make sure that there isn't a point of view that isn't going to be heard in the group. Because actually, even as
mm,
chair or as leader, you have a certain amount of ability to create that culture of psychological safety, but actually, there might be another member of that meeting which is going to always restrict or constrain that feeling that others have, depending on the
mm,
dynamics outside that meeting. And so those
mm,
one-to-one conversations sometimes, if it's a high stakes decision, might be worth the time to make sure you're
mm.
seeking out alternative points of view. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Which brings me to the question, what have we missed,
Mm.
Lucy? What are we not saying? What else is there on this topic that feels important?
So I feel that there's sort of different threads here. There's a one's own confidence to speak up,
Mm,
and we've talked a bit about body language, about managing an inner critic. There's something in there about using your voice early in a meeting. So chatting to the person next to you. So many meetings when people are just on their devices, and whether that's in a room or on a screen. Practice using your voice early. It builds a bit of confidence for when you put your hand up
yeah,
to say the thing. You might get a buddy for your meeting and say, I'm going to say this. I'm going to say this thing. I'm just letting you know. Um, See what they feel about it. Perhaps they can back you, or perhaps they've got a counter argument. That's okay. But just knowing that somebody's going to be engaging with you when you're speaking can be helpful. What else?
so one of the things that occurred to me is it doesn't happen very often, but I think earlier in my career, sometimes I'd get to the end of a meeting and think, I've really got to say something. I've really got to say something. But actually, it's not that I've got a burning thing I want to say and I'm not able to say it. It's just an awareness that my voice needs to be in this room and I'm not quite sure what I'm going to say. Um, and actually, one of the things that I taught myself to do was the notes that I take are not the factual notes of what's being said in the room. It's me engaging with the information that's being shared in the room. So
Hmm.
actually, even though I might only say one thing in a meeting, my notes are filled with how do we know? What if? You know, it's my
Yeah, I know.
engagement of my thinking
Yeah,
process with the content that I'm
yeah,
listening to, so that I'm not passively just absorbing the content of the meeting conversation. I'm engaging with it
yeah,
all the way. And when
yeah,
I take notes that way, I discovered, and this might just be me, I'm quite talkative. I discovered that it's very rare for me to get to the end of the meeting and not want to vocalize at least one of those jotting
yeah,
down things I've written. So maybe there's something about actually, if you do feel you want to speak up more, but you're not even sure what you're going to say, maybe it's about how you engage with the content and the note taking style that you're
yeah,
using.
yeah. And as you are writing those notes, you come up with questions
Yeah.
that are helpful to be voiced. I think another tactic, and again, we're all different, right? And what I think that something that might be helpful is, if we're in a meeting space now, not a conference space, if you're going to a meeting, if it's a good meeting, you'll know why you're there and what your input is. You can have some thoughts beforehand that you can jot down. These if meeting about this topic, these are the things that are important that get talked about in the room, whether you say them or they're said by somebody else. So you can do a little bit of preparation. And then I think what I see happening is that when you have that, oh, I need to say something, I need to say something, oh, we're halfway through, or I need to say something, you stop listening because you're so keen to say your thing. And actually, this is kind of reflecting back what you've just said, but in a different way. It's really listening to what's going on. And it's more important to listen and engage than it is to say the thing that's on your list.
Yeah.
And I know that I see in meetings when people are really anxious and they've got their thing they need to say, the conversation doesn't flow because somebody says something that's obviously their thing on the list because they need to say something.
Yeah.
So what's my point here? Know why you're going, know where your input is. If you're a subject matter expert, you might be really needed to set some of the context. If you're having thoughts as the meeting goes on, jot them down, but not at the expense of not listening to the dialogue and being using your body language in a steady hand at a point when you want to make a point. And even if the conversation has moved on, to just make sure that you're linking it back
Yeah.
to an important point that you need to make that relates to the topic. And
Yeah.
and if you're chairing a meeting, get some training or coaching about chairing meetings to enable everybody to have their voice.
I think we said that on the one that we did about meetings was get feedback. And I think maybe it's the same for this. If you're thinking
Yeah,
I want to speak up more, then actually asking a peer around the table, look, can we meet up afterwards and get some feedback on
yeah,
what you thought I could have done differently or what you think I did well and how I could be even better if after this meeting, if there's a particular skill that you're working on yourself. And actually, one final thought that occurred to me, you mentioned they're linking the comment to the flow of the conversation as it
mm,
continues. Actually, that is another great way to ask a question, is to say, well, we're saying this now. We said that 5 minutes ago. What's the connection between those two? Or is there any tension between those two? And
yeah,
that's another sign of a great strategic thinker, but it doesn't take a lot of thinking power to actually ask the question. It's a very simple question, but it's that you've made a
yeah,
connection about something that we maybe the rest of the group hasn't necessarily considered.
yeah.
Yeah,
And to make those good connections, it's about being 100% present and really
exactly,
listening to
exactly.
what's going on.
Yeah, definitely, definitely. Okay, so what are your top tips? What do you want people to kind of take away if they don't take away the whole of our conversation today?
I think that if what we've talked about today resonates with you at all, that you've ever been in a meeting or a conference and not put your hand up to say something because something you're an inner critic, something internal's happening for you, do a little bit of work understanding what that is to try and unlock it. You could work with Juliet or you could work
Yeah,
on your own. There's different books and resources around what might be, I'm making some assumptions here, but it might be some form of imposter syndrome, an inner narrative undermining you in order to keep you safe.
yeah,
Um, and I think Remember why it's important to speak up. And sometimes you might not need to, it might not be important that you speak up, and that is okay. You don't have to say 25 words at every meeting, but it's making a deliberate decision. I've got an opinion here that I need to be heard, or I'm really happy just listening and taking it in, and I will reflect and I'll perhaps come back with something after the meeting. That is also fine. I think that's my two things, but they were quite lengthy. So over to you, Juliet. What have we missed, or what are your things that
So I'm going to say something completely different, which is the world needs your voice. Our world, and I'm not going to go into all of the reasons why, but our world is potentially on a track that is not going to end up with a thriving human race for a whole variety of different reasons. And one of the ways that we use our personal power to make a difference is to speak up. Now, that's not to say that you have to speak up, because no, you don't. You just need to, do what feels right for you. But if you're ever in doubt that what you're about to say is going to be groundbreakingly important in this meeting, that's not the bar by which we're measuring this. The world needs more voices heard. And in getting that diversity of thinking into as many meeting rooms as possible, we have a greater chance of solving some of the big challenges that we face as a human race. I've gone very deep,
you
completely off
have?
topic, Lucy. But
Yeah,
actually,
my
I think that's what came
goodness.
to mind for me as being,
Yeah,
we've talked tactically, but at the end of the
yeah,
day, this is something we need to hear. We need to hear lots of different voices around these tables.
yeah. And the more we practice,
Yeah,
the
yeah,
stronger our voices become.
yeah, exactly, exactly. Right, on that deep and meaningful note, should we wrap up this
Yeah.
time? So, thank you for spending this time with us. I'm Juliet Corbett, an executive coach and strategist working one to one with senior leaders.
And I'm Lucy Gower, a facilitator, trainer, and coach helping leaders develop high performing teams. If you've enjoyed this episode, please share with colleagues and help leverage the impact of the quiet leadership revolution.